I think you're here to provide some testimony on S115.
Yes, that's correct.
Well, good morning, welcome. If you would just introduce yourself and briefly tell us more about the organization you work for, and then you can go right ahead.
Great, thank you. Appreciate you having me here, representatives of the committee. My name is Christine Doherty. I am the Vice President in Green Mountain Water and Environment Association. We are an association in Green Mountain. We represent over 400 members who work in the water quality sector, including wastewater, water supply, and stormwater operators, both the municipal and private sectors. I'm here today because the Senate Bill 115, which is before you now and being discussed, has raised concerns for a number of our members, and for good reasons, particularly the sections related to the stormwater utility fees and the assessment of those fees to parcels that are located within communities that have stormwater utility fees. I wanted to just kind of provide some clarification because throughout this whole process, when really looking at S115, there's been a lot of confusion about what stormwater utility fees actually are assessed for, what they do, what these stormwater utility programs, what they regulate, what they don't regulate. And really I'm here to try to provide for you today is some clarification around some of those topics. While each municipality is kind of unique in its own right, in the way that they approach things, stormwater utility fees and the stormwater utility programs are fairly consistent. So I do believe the information I'll be providing today can be applied across can be applied to the municipalities that have these utility programs. First, I want to start off by saying that these stormwater utility fees, they're exactly that. They're not permits. They're not regulating anything. They are fees that are assessed to parcel owners, property owners, specifically properties which have impervious surface. I've heard some questions in prior conversations within this committee about concerns with, stormwater utilities regulating agricultural activities, in say a field that doesn't have any type of impervious surface. If an agricultural field is being, is growing, say corn or wheat or other products, that's not that those parcels aren't being assessed utility fees. These utility fees are assessed based on impervious surfaces because that creates an equitable way to collect the utility across the board. So if you have a single family home, that's a lot of times establishes the baseline area, square footage of impervious surfaces, which these utilities get allocated based on. If you have, so a single family unit, single family home, assessed a stormwater utility fee. If you have a commercial space, which, our facility, let's think about a big box store, you're likely going to have higher utility rates because you have significantly more impervious surfaces. The reason why the impervious surfaces are used in collecting these fees is because of the ability to make the fees equitable for all. It's not designed to punish anybody for having impervious surfaces. It's not designed to, make any judgments about of any of those parcels, but it is a way to keep it equitable for all those that are subject to the fees. And again, I just want to go back to, agricultural practices, the farm fields, those are not subject to the utility fees. It's when you start to have structures for greenhouses, homes, barns, structures that create impervious surfaces. And it's not that the fee is going to, or that there's regulations around those structures, but it's a way to say, okay, you have these impervious structures, and we can use that as a mechanism to calculate what would be an equitable fee to be contributed to the overall objective of the utility. These utilities are stood up and put in place because we have water quality issues that need to be addressed in this state. It's not new news that Lake Champlain has some concerns with phosphorus. There's also local streams and rivers that also have different impairments for bacteria, E. coli. You have stormwater impairments. You have sediment. There needs to be a mechanism by which we can address these water quality issues. And these stormwater utility fees and these stormwater utility programs allow municipalities to address those concerns that are within their community and to do so in an equitable manner. I also want to, talk about really highlight the fact again that these are not permits. Nobody's, these utility fees, nobody's applying to them to say, hey, I want to build a building or I want to do these activities and here's my application, can you permit it? It's not what's happening. The utility is being applied based on what's there or what the owner chooses to construct and place on their property. The idea of looking at impervious surfaces is not new either. We are all probably familiar with the 39050 permit, which is commonly known as the 3-acre permit. We do understand that impervious surfaces do have direct impacts on water quality, and that also feeds into the supporting, the justification behind using impervious surfaces as a mechanism to really come up with the calculations on what people and parcel owners should be charged and what they should be contributing to these utility programs. There's correlations that are here that are long-standing. These utility fees are not new. They've really gone through the gambit. They've been assessed and evaluated. A lot of these have been in place for over a decade. And they're there for good reason, again, because our communities need to improve our water quality, and this is a way to do so. I've also heard reference that these, maybe we should be charging a tax for these instead of a utility fee. The reason why utility fees are set up is very specific, it's very intentional. These utility fees, because they're utilities, those fees collected have to be used for the purpose of that utility. And what we have here is utilities that's stood up to improve water quality. If this was a tax, then you'd have your local officials would be able to reallocate those funds if they felt there were other needs. I threw out there in the letter I submitted to you, I suggested maybe line striping as an example. By using the utility fee structure, it prevents the ability for these for what's collected to be reallocated and to be used in other places. So I think it's really important that we really take into consideration the potential impacts of what's being proposed here. This is not going to just affect farmers if there's a determination that these shouldn't be in place or that municipalities shouldn't be collecting utility fees. One more point I do want to address, which I've heard a lot of, and I would like to address directly, is that farmers already have RAPs, and that there's already regulations that are in place for that. There are, what I want to compare that to is you have, again, going back to the 3-acre permit or other operational stormwater permits. It's not uncommon. You're likely have heard from your constituents. We have residential developments. We have commercial developments that are required to construct and implement water quality treatment practices, gravel wetlands, water quality ponds. Those parcels that are subject to having those stormwater treatment practices on their property to mitigate their impacts are still subject to utility fees. They're not, because they have those practices in place in their property doesn't give them an opportunity, doesn't waive their requirements to participate in these utility fee programs. And so to suggest that because agriculture already has some practices in place and REPs are there, but they are limited to, the practices that they apply to, that's equivalent to a stormwater treatment practice on an established or a commercial or residential development. And so to say that, a farm structure shouldn't be subject to a stormwater utility fee because they already have practices in place, it's essentially saying that anybody who has a stormwater treatment practice on their parcel also shouldn't be subject to a stormwater utility fee. That, that chain of events could really undermine the entire, all the work that's been done over the last 15 years to improve water quality in our state. And we have a long way to go still. We really need everybody to be involved. We really need everybody to participate. There have been some questions about, are there more equitable ways to do this? And, we've even heard from staff at the EPA that there's concerns about the effects that this could have if it's allowed to move forward. And that was the reason why a study was proposed and pushed forward to be able to look at the potential impacts of what this, what's being proposed would have. And so I would encourage this committee, if nothing else, to at least support the study moving forward. But my takeaway today for you would be to strike the language altogether for section 7 and 8 from the original bill. But if you're not willing to do that, then at least allow the study to go forward so that we can show the necessity of these utility fees and the necessity that for everybody to be participating equitably so that we can meet our objectives of improving water quality in the state of Vermont. And thank you for the opportunity and happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Christine. And let's see if we've got any questions from the committee. Representative Graham has a question.
Can you give us examples of what kind of projects have you done on this with these fees?
Sure, absolutely. So for so in MS4, municipal separate stormwater sewer systems, these are permits that are required for communities that are discharging stormwater to impaired water bodies. So in order to improve those water bodies, the fees that are collected can go to things like stabilizing roadside drainage channels, which are conveyances of stormwater. They're acknowledged by the EPA and by the state as conveyances of stormwater and are required, therefore, to be stabilized and to minimize the impacts associated. So, doing things like stabilizing roadside ditches, putting in culverts and maintaining, repairing culverts. Some places, sometimes with private properties, there's been some partnerships with municipalities where they've worked with the residents to implement stormwater treatment practices, water quality ponds. There's also been some, let me back up here. There's also the administrative side of these permits. As you heard from James Sherrard yesterday from Burlington, their program, is over $1 million annually to administer. That's not something that can just come out of their general fund. There needs to be a mechanism for them to be able to collect the revenues to be able to meet these permit requirements. I would say the majority of the revenues that are collected are going back to meeting meeting the program requirements established by the state.
Oh, go ahead, Betty.
So mainly it's just road ditch projects do with this.
No, I want to say that it's mainly that. So there's six minimum requirements of an MS4 general permit. So we're required by those permits to do public education and outreach. I understand there was some questions yesterday in this committee about, maybe not having seen these types of public education and outreach. I would encourage you to take a look at the Stream Team or Rethink Runoff website, where we do a lot of public outreach and education. We hold rain barrel events. We hold events that bring awareness to the importance of water quality. If you've ever seen storm drains that have signs on them that say no dumping, this runs directly to a stream. That education and outreach is part of those efforts that are supported by this. We're required to have oversight on construction activities. Construction activities have been identified as a significant contributor of potential pollutants to our water quality bodies. So we have to have staffing resources. Municipalities have to have staffing resources to be able to go out and actually to meet that charge. And that's a charge that's established by the EPA and administered by the state. And then the delegations, delegated by the state to the municipalities in the state of Vermont. We have to look at our own facilities. So our own public works facilities have to be reviewed and monitored. Any of the source of pollutants that we have and that we use have to be mitigated. The salts that get laid down on streets have to be collected. Anything that gets reaches the roads, you think about farms and agriculture, you drive past a farm, you see the mud gets tracked out in the road. That ends up that gets tracked down the road. That ends up on the curb lines. We have other activities, waste that blows out, gets dropped off, either blown out of a vehicle or, comes off private property. That all has to get collected. So we have to do street sweeping, catch basin cleaning. There's a number of charges that are required under general permit that are met with these utility fees. So it's significantly more than just roadside drainage ditches. I was just using that as an example.
Representative O'Brien.
Christine, how do municipalities, the MS4 municipalities, arrive at a budget for the utilities? I mean, they have charges, but I assume they have to have a budget every year, and then from that they figure out the fees for the impervious surfaces or given landowners.
Yeah, so it's as with any other utility, you have charges, you have costs that are associated. So there are some municipalities that have agreed to take over some of the stormwater infrastructure because the operation and maintenance of them is beyond their means, or if they don't have HOAs in place to manage those systems, the state has looked to the municipalities to take over those systems. So you have operational costs associated with that. You have, again, staffing requirements. As you would run any budget, you have to look at your annual costs. What are they projected to be? What is the maintenance and cost of maintaining your infrastructure? And then what is what do you need to collect from a fee to meet those requirements?
Because I'm wondering if, say, the charge is to do so much every year for these utilities, if there's a shortfall and they don't have enough in their budget to do that, where do they go to make up that gap?
That's a good question. I wouldn't want to speak directly, on behalf of any particular municipalities. If there's a budget gap on that, I think that's something that they would have to figure out internally. So I don't know of any examples where that's happened. Hopefully they're being properly managed. That would be the intention, is to properly manage them, not to have shortcomings in their revenues. I know some municipalities have had to increase their fees over the years in order to meet the increased operational costs and administration of the programs. But I don't want to speak to on behalf of any specific municipality or how they would handle that.
Representative Templeman.
So this is very likely a municipality specific question, but I'm trying to get a sense of proportion of the shortfall and what that would look like for municipalities as like a percentage of budget. So, given a random example of St. Albans, I mean, this is all hypothetical, but if their total budget for stormwater is $300,000 and, they've been collecting $70,000 worth of fees from farms, we can deduce a percentage. What are we looking at here as an impact in the perspective of a percentage on the different municipalities? And not expecting you to actually have that data, but kind of curious if you do.
I certainly don't. I think you identified the real concern with and real issue with trying to get that information is that you have communities like St. Albans, which has more agricultural practices than, say, the city of Burlington. But I would, there's a couple of points here. One of them being that, again, the initial intention behind S115 was that there was concerns that these stormwater utility fees were ultimately regulating agricultural activities and therefore should not be valid. And I'm here to give testimony to say that that's an inaccurate assessment and concern, that these utilities are not, they're not regulations. They don't regulate activities. They don't direct a farmer how to manage their land. And so the other concern with it is that they should be exempt from these fees because they are exempt from the Clean Water Act and the requirements of the Clean Water Act. And again, this is not requiring the farms to take any actions. This is not regulating them. This is not replacing the RAPs. This is not in addition to the RAPs. This is something that's separate, saying that these farms exist in the community, which that community has been identified to contribute to, the stormwater from that community is going to a receiving water body, which has been identified as being impaired. And that community is then charged with improving improving the water quality of the surface waters that receive that community's stormwater. And so as members of that community, and all members of that community need to share in that responsibility.
So, Christine, thank you for all of those answers. I'll just say, so we've been thinking about this question. There's two questions really. One is sort of philosophical: should farms be required to pay the way that other landowners are based on their impervious surfaces? And that gets to the question of whether they're already doing something that other landowners are not. And you spoke to that briefly. The other question is more of a legal question, and whether in fact the utilities have the authority under existing law to assess a fee. And it really gets to the question, I think, of regulation. So can you give us a legal answer, if you feel qualified to, whether towns that don't, a town let me back up here. If a farmer or anyone failed to pay the fee that was assessed, does the utility or the town have authority to go in and force the farmer to pay, or any landowner?
So I'm not specialized in the laws as it relates to utilities, but the challenge with stormwater utilities versus other utilities such as water and sewer, in which you may have direct connections that are piped. You cannot just turn off these services. We don't have any way to no longer receive. Municipality doesn't have any way of no longer receiving the stormwater. It's not piped necessarily. I mean, it is conveyed, which is the reason why why this is regulated. The conveyance of stormwater, the actual collection and conveyance of it. And as soon as you, as a property owner, touch that water, or as soon as that water touches your property, then you're responsible for the pollutants that it picks up and transfers. So I don't know necessarily how the repercussions of that would fall out. I do believe that the way that it was set up and the way that it's established under state law, I do believe that municipalities would have resources available to them to be able to put a lien on a property or to require payment. again, I don't know exactly how that would work out, but I do understand that that there are mechanisms for leveraging compliance that are established in current state law. And my understanding is that was really established when the first stormwater utility was set up almost 15 years ago now in the state of Vermont, that these legal questions were very closely evaluated and considered. And if they have been challenged to date, they weren't successful, and if they haven't been, then I would suggest that would speak to the clarification of that authorization.
Representative O'Brien.
I was just wondering, if this whole thing about impervious surfaces being metric seems like some impervious surfaces are less so than others. So, for example, if a resident turned their house into a living machine, they have gardens on the roof, so essentially not one drop of water reached the stormwater system on that property, they still have to pay like everybody else?
Yeah, so this is not necessarily, again, I think there's some confusion that these utility fees they're not trying to say, okay, you're contributing, you're not contributing. But the whole concept of the impervious surface was to try to find something that was equitable to make these calculations based on, right? So when the utilities are typically set up, they'll do an assessment on impervious surfaces of the average size single family home for that community. And then that is generally the base of, the baseline square footage in which the equivalent residential unit or ERU is determined. And then that way you can actually compare apples to apples when you're comparing, or saying, okay, you're a single family residence and you should, you're required to pay 1 ERU, or you're a commercial structure with 3 times the impervious surface of the average community or household in this community. And so you're going to pay proportionately accordingly. Oftentimes it's not 300, 300 times what a resident is, or 3 times what the resident is, but oftentimes it is more. And this is not a practice that's new to Vermont. This isn't something that we've seen here. I've practiced in stormwater across multiple states throughout this country, and this is a common approach to identifying ways for municipalities to be able to get the resources needed to meet their permit requirements. Is the use of impervious surfaces to the calculation of impervious surfaces to assess utility fees. But the percentage of impervious, having impervious is generally the baseline threshold. So again, you're a farmer, your cornfield is not being assessed fees. You're not saying, okay, well, you have 100 acres of agricultural land, we're going to charge you based on that. That's not what's happening today.
Right, but that it seems consistent that if a house had no impervious surface, they're still being charged for impervious surface. Just like those.
So they're being assessed a utility fee. Okay, right. So they're not, because it's what you're suggesting is that, again, it goes to follow that train of thought and that logic, right? Would to say that, well, if you're a property owner, or if you're a community, let's take communities because the 3-acre permit really affects a lot of communities. If you're a community and you have a water quality treatment practice that mitigates the stormwater runoff from your property, should all of those properties then be relieved of the stormwater utility fee requirements because they're mitigating the stormwater from their properties? Or are they still part of the community that has to work together and collectively to address the historic impacts that community has had on the receiving waters?
Right, I understand that, but you just said farm fields would not be considered.
I don't believe any municipality currently is charging a utility fee based on a farmer's field.
Well, it seems then in the same way, if I tore my house down and lived in a tent, that property then wouldn't have impervious surfaces. I wouldn't have to contribute to the community.
I think that's something, what you're saying, right, I understand what you're saying. So if the house has zero discharge of stormwater, good luck with that. I mean, but if in theory it could happen, I think that would need to be assessed on a per case basis. We're really, I mean, not to have water run off a parcel is almost impossible. To have 100% infiltration rate is nearly impossible. And again, this is about the impacts that a community has had historically, and that our past practices have had. We're not only mitigating impacts of water quality in the future, we're trying to correct what's happened from our past. These water bodies are already impaired. We need to take steps today to make them better. And that requires the community as a whole to work together to make those improvements.
Right. Well, thank you again for joining us. And I don't see any other questions, so we'll let you go. And
thank you.
We're gonna stay on the same topic. We've got Michael Grady is with us now. Mike, if you want to come up to the table. Mike, I don't know, it might be helpful to just start by asking whether, since you were here and able to listen to the testimony we just received, whether from a legal standpoint anything struck you, just as we're thinking about the amendment that you wrote, that we looked at yesterday, with the new sections 8 and 9.
Sure. So I want to reiterate that municipalities do have authority to adopt bylaws to regulate stormwater, but any bylaw that they adopt is subject to the general limitations on bylaws. One of those limitations is that municipalities shall not regulate the RAPs. Now, the municipal entities are focused on that this is not regulation. Well, under their utility authority for rates, they essentially put a lien on your property, and then they can follow the authority for tax foreclosure sale after failure to pay for 2 years. And then they can take your property. To me, that is regulation. In addition, underneath their bylaws, for example, in South Burlington, if you want to offset or get a credit from your fee, you have to comply with certain conditions and standards for that credit. And then any award of credit shall be conditioned on continuing compliance with the city's design and performance standards as stated in the Stormwater User Fee Credit Manual. That is regulation. They are regulating farms, or they are potentially regulating farms. So I don't see any way that you can argue that they're not regulating when, in order to get a credit, you have to comply with their performance standards.
Could you read that first part again one more time that you said that they are regulating?
I don't see how you could argue that they are not regulating when, in order to receive a credit, you have to comply with the city's performance standards.
Representative Kintley.
So do the RAPs regulate impervious farm surfaces?
The RAPs regulate the production area. And the production area is generally made up of a mix of impervious and pervious surfaces.
So yes. No.
Go ahead, Dave.
So concerning, most farms have a personal home area that is not part of the farm. Is there jurisdiction by townships on that?
Yes,
So a township could assess a fee to a farm, not specifically the farming aspect, but the housing aspect they could.
right. As the witness just said to Representative O'Brien, you're likely to still gonna have an equivalent residential unit charge assessed against you, even if you are collecting everything that comes off of your property. But that's not how they're calculating the fee for farm impervious surface. They're not saying, oh, you just have a fee. They are calculating based on the amount of impervious surface on the farm.
Just remind us whether impervious surface on farm or not on a farm includes driveways.
Generally, yes, it does, because impervious surface includes dirt roads and paved roads.
Representative O'Brien?
Mike, do you know if the South Burlington credit is similar to Burlington's and you can get it reduced by half, or is it a sliding scale?
Half is the maximum amount, yes.
Okay. That's in these utility rules?
That's in their stormwater ordinance.
Does the PUC somehow get involved with these utilities?
No, and that's actually a point I was going to raise. Although there is, as the previous witness said, relative consistency, they are not entirely consistent. And maybe they should be. Maybe there should be an entity that ensures that they are regulating consistently, so you don't have a credit available to one property owner in one town, but not available to a property owner in another.
Representative Graham?
So do these utilities have to charge fees to collect revenue, or can they use some other source to collect revenue?
Well, they're formed under, well, let's step back. This is the Dillon's Rule state. Municipalities only have the authority that you give them, whether it's in statute or in their charter. You have given municipalities the ability to form sewer districts, sewer utilities, et cetera. And you defined underneath that authority that stormwater includes sewer, and you've allowed those utilities to charge rates for their services. It doesn't say what rate that they can assess, because it changes from municipality to municipality. As I'm sure you all know, if you live in a municipality with the water system, the rate can fluctuate. So they have authority to assess rates and fees. So that's what they have authority to do. And as the previous witness noted, the rates and fees are then dedicated for the use of the district/system.
They have the authority to charge different users different rates.
Yes, and they do.
And that's it. Then there's no regulation over that at all.
There's no entity that oversees the sewer and stormwater ordinances that are adopted by municipalities. They're subject to litigation. Somebody can sue and say that they're not assessed equitably, or et cetera.
Representative O'Brien?
Does it have to be impervious surfaces, or could we use a metric like per capita?
Well, the statute doesn't say what the rate is for their services. So there's no really limit right now on how they assess the fee, what they assess it on. As the previous witness said, the use of impervious surface is very common across the country.
Acreage potentially, or
Yeah, and back, because I was here when the authority was granted to municipalities to form utilities, and I was here 15, 16 years ago. And I do live in South Burlington, which was the first stormwater utility. And there were discussions on how to do it and how to apply. In all phases of that evolution, there were discussions on how to apply it and what to apply it to. And do you do it on acreage? Do you do it on a actual calculation basis? When do you do the actual calculation versus using the equivalent residential unit survey? All of those conversations were had mainly at the municipal level, not at the state legislative level. And I'm not a stormwater utility expert. These people are like so deep in what they do and so skilled in it. What I'm an expert in is legislative authority. And like municipal bylaws can't regulate RAPs. They regulate stormwater. They have to be consistent with NBSA 1264, which says that A&R can't permit stormwater. The MS4 says it doesn't apply to farms. The NIPTES, federal EPA NIPTES rule says it doesn't apply to agricultural stormwater. So to me, it becomes a question of legislative intent. Did you intend to say to a municipality that you can't permit a farm, you can't regulate the construction of a structure on a farm, you can't regulate the practices on the farm, but you can assess a $10,000 fee on the farm? Is that your legislative intent? And I don't speak to legislative intent because I've gotten in trouble doing that.
Representative Levitt.
Well, I guess my question is, sorry to put you on the spot now, how do we then speak about legislative intent?
Well, you are the ultimate policymaker. As I said, Dillon's rules state any authority that the municipality has comes ultimately from you. And what you delegate to them, for example, the ability for this city, any city, to adopt a stormwater bylaw comes from you. And you can set standards or criteria for that. And you have. And so it's really you. The state agencies, the municipalities, they all tell you that they have policymaking authority, and they do because you gave it to them. You are the ultimate policymaker. That's what the Supreme Court and the Constitution says. So as long as you're constitutional, you can work within the policy parameters that you set.
Representative Rice.
So it seems to me like the whole thing actually hinges on, is this regulation, right? Like we follow your logic train in coming to the conclusion that they can't regulate farms. And so then they make the argument, this isn't regulation.
Right.
And then we talked about it a little bit, but is there sort of somewhere where you can point to legally that says clearly like, well, this assessing this fee is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish there was a Supreme Court case that said taxation is regulation. Not really, there isn't. Or fee setting is regulation without any conditions. But there's obviously condition. If you don't pay, they put a lien on your property. If you want to credit, you have to perform. And frankly, they have made policy-making decisions for their credits. You asked, I can't remember who asked, the airport. What does the airport pay for a fee? If the airport gets a credit, like any NIPTES permitted facility gets a credit, and the airport works under a NIPTES permit, so they automatically get a credit.
Mike, we also received some written testimony yesterday, I think, from the city of St. Albans that on our committee page, and I don't know if committee members had a chance to look at it. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but it also is trying to, I think, thread this needle or get at the legality question. And it might be useful. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but
I did not. I reviewed the testimony of the witness from Burlington. And he made a couple of good points about the language, but he also kind of has a fundamental different interpretation about whether this is regulation or not.
so I'm not going to read I'm going to read only 7 or 8 words from the letter. And if it'd be helpful to the committee, we can pull it up and look at it, but I'm not sure how helpful it would be if you haven't had a chance to review it. But the key sentence here is, however, stormwater utility fees and stormwater permit fees are different revenue mechanisms levied for different purposes. So, and this comes after,
Could you read that again?
yes, stormwater utility fees and stormwater permit fees are different revenue mechanisms levied for different purposes.
I agree with that, and that's going back to the limitation in 2291, which says that the municipality can adopt a stormwater ordinance, provided that it's consistent with the limitations in 10 VSA 1264. 10 VSA 1264 is an exemption under A&R Stormwater Authority that says A&R cannot permit required agricultural practices. So under the municipality's logic, A&R can assess that farm, whatever fee it wants to assess, as long as it's not a permit fee. I don't know if that was your legislative intent.
Are there other questions? So,
Does that happen?
No.
oh, yeah.
There are certain activities on a farm that A&R does regulate. For example, the RAPs don't necessarily apply to disturbance and construction of a farm structure. So if you're going to build a farm structure, you may need to comply with the construction general permit. And that's something that A&R does regulate. But that they don't, that's not technically an RAP.
Representative Grant.
Household properties are assessed the same, or is it different based on the size of their?
It as the previous witness noted, there's something about then that's generally for residents, they just use the ERU.
So, Mike, stay here for another 5 minutes if you would. And I'm wondering whether anybody wants to sort of jump in here, summarizing where you think we are. What other testimony you might want to hear, what the key decisions are that we might want to be making.
Before going to a summary, I'm actually just one more question,
Please, yeah.
Mike, if you would. on impervious surfaces that are shared between home and farm, like say a long driveway, how much of that driveway should be in the wraps and how much should be assessed by a municipality for stormwater? I mean, should be is, I know I'm kind of putting you out there, but.
You know, that's something that's probably addressed in bylaws. They'll probably calculate the driveway as part of the farm.
So it's in statute already.
No, it's probably in their bylaws.
Oh, bylaws of a municipality.
Yeah.
Right. That could be problematic too, because again, that's their interpretation.
Right. I mean, they do use A&R Stormwater Management Manual as a kind of a foundation of their bylaws. But, yeah, it will be dependent on how they interpret it and how they administer.
Which we've already seen is controversial.
I go back to the legislative intent question. Like everywhere you turn says the municipality doesn't regulate or the municipality cannot adopt a bylaw that addresses, the municipality cannot permit. Agricultural stormwater runoff is not subject to a permit. Developed lands do not include farms. But you can assess a fee on them according to the municipality.
That's what I was going to say is I'm reading the letter. Properties that pay a fee towards stormwater regulation on site, whether it be via RAPS or an A&R stormwater permit, still have to pay a stormwater utility fee. So they're seeing it as something separate rather than the RAPS and the A&R fee covers that.
Not a bylaw. It's not a,
They're basically saying that's the price of being in this community.
Right.
Because everybody pays into that.
But you are the policymaker, right? You get to say what they can charge for or not.
Representative Pearl. Yeah, I guess I feel like the question is not even what the intent, I guess for me, what the intent was, it's what the intent is for us right now. And do we want to spell it out that this is not our intention and that farms are already obligated under the RAPS to control stormwater and are doing their fair share? And I mean, that's, I guess, the opinion I'm of, is less about trying to decipher this idea of what was it supposed to be and more, what do we think it should be? I guess that makes sense. And I have my own opinions, but I don't know what everybody else is feeling.
Representative Graham. What if we made it so that these utilities could only charge same rate for residential housing on the resident and fire, any other fire structure?
I think you could do that. For example, when AOT had the same issue with municipal stormwater utilities, you said that AOT has to get a 35% credit. Just period. And so I think if you wanted to, you could say a farm will be assessed or receive a credit of, or whatever you decide as your policy, you can do that.
If it was assessed on the residential house, then they can't say they're not all in.
I understand.
You can't assess anything on.
What was that?
But can't assess anything on the farm bill.
I understand what you're saying.
I don't think. It's just my thought.
Representative O'Brien.
Like it says in the St. Albans City letter, if a community is penalized for not meeting its MS4 requirements, et cetera, has that happened? Are some of these MS4 utilities or the town, the municipalities getting penalized?
I'm not aware of that. I mean, there is enforcement. They do operate under a permit, and there are repercussions for failure to meet the permit requirements. But I'm not aware of any A&R enforcement authority. I can check into that if you would like.
Any other thoughts? I know people are, maybe some people have to leave for another meeting, so why don't we wrap up? We're on the floor at 1. We'll be back here after that, estimated around 2:30. We'll see if you're available at all this afternoon.
I had a lot of things scheduled kind of last.
Okay.
So I have to look and see exactly what my availability.
So I'll also just mention that we did get another piece of communication from St. Albans City with some proposed language. I don't know if that's made it.
I saw that.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any objections to that, but after listening to the testimony from Mr. Sherrard, I believe.
Yesterday?
Right out from Burlington. And his statement that the language doesn't apply to the fees on impervious surface, which is the language that Steve and I started out with. That we started out with language that said they shall not assess a fee on impervious surface or runoff from it. And then DEC with EPA came back with the language that it did. I can give you new language that addresses Mr. Sherrard's concerns and I think balances the A&R and EPA concerns.
We just want to be sure that they did, so that we're not going back and forth and.
Right. Would you want me to draft some language and send that to A&R?
If that's something you can squeeze in, that'd be great. Yeah.
Sure.
All right. Well, let's break then for now, and we'll back to this afternoon to the extent that we can.